Okay, welcome to Cisco Networking Academy. Today we are having the Cisco One class present static and dynamic routing.
So what is static/dynamic routing? Static routing is a type of network routing technique that uses a manually configured routing entry. Static routes are fixed and do not change if the network is changed or reconfigured. It is essentially manually done by the system administrator. For dynamic routing, routing protocols find the routes for traversing the packets, and it uses a route that a network routing protocol adjusts automatically for topology or traffic change.
It seems like my information is just an echo of that. So static routing is basically what we do here in Cisco. We manually configure all of the router entries. But the thing is, even if the router is changed, it's reconfigured, the routes stay the same. Hence, that's where the name static comes from. They don't change. Dynamic routing, on the other hand, as the system uses, I guess, an algorithm, that's what you call it, to configure the routes. It requires the system to be able to automatically process the best possible routes off of a bunch of factors that I don't quite understand, but it is impressive. Like, for example, they will quote unquote route around damages, like if a node is missing, which is a connecting point between two routes, stuff like that.
So there's advantages and disadvantages for each of them. For static routing, some of the advantages are that it's a lot easier to implement them when you're using a smaller network, like only a few PCs. It's a lot easier to just use static than it is to bother with doing dynamic. It's very secure and it has no ads, which are sometimes sent with dynamic routing protocols. It's very predictable because it has one path to get somewhere. It's always the same path no matter what. So you always know how it's going to work, what the destination will be. And that since there's no routing algorithm or protocol that's used, it doesn't need to use any extra resources like CPU and memory. But some of the disadvantages are that it can't reroute if something goes wrong. Like what Kobe said, if there's a node missing, then you have to reconfigure things manually so that the packets can go to the destination. It's only really suitable for simple networks. With bigger networks and more complex networks, it's not really very useful because there's so many other possibilities of things that can go wrong or routes to take. And when the complexity of the system increases, it gets much, much more time consuming to configure all the routes manually instead of just using an algorithm of some sort.
So the advantages and disadvantages of dynamic routing. Now, dynamic routing is a lot better for several routers, and it's usually, as you can see in the picture, set up with multiple routers, unlike static, which is only like usually a couple. And it's better with several routers because it can automatically pick up different pathways to go through. So if a router's down or if there's a pathway blocked, like what Kobe said, with the node being down or something like that, that the pathways can change, and that's based on the topology, basically just like how the routers and everything is set up in the network. And the network size shouldn't really matter because it's big enough that people can just change the pathways of the router. The downfalls of this is that it might be harder to set up initially because there's so many routers to configure, but when it's actually all set up, it's a lot easier to configure all of the routers since it's just one big network and not just a bunch of little pathways connected, and the routes can keep changing. The other problem is that it's less secure because routing updates are sent out and with multicast data because it's distributed to a bigger group of recipients. Since each router, like as you can see in the picture, there's a bunch of switches and a bunch of routers connected. A lot of the data is sent out to like a mass group, so it will become less secure. But you can fix that things with routing protocol authentication or passive interfaces, which limits the update and like makes it more you need authentication to go through a certain or to access certain information. But those are a hassle to update. But you need to do it if you want better security. But also, there's additional resources like the CPU, bandwidth, and memory. They might have to be used also because it's so big and different routes might need to be taken to get the data through it.